Okay, next is DJ McNeil. Is going to talk about comparing Golden-winged Warbler full season productivity and occupancy across 4 regions of the breeding distribution. So now you don't have to.
Great, thanks, Charlie. Okay, so let's continue with our theme here of exploring these forested systems and understanding how species respond to habitat restoration with the Golden-winged Warbler. So, habitat restoration is an essential tool in the conservation toolbox for many species. Pick your favorite. I'm partial to the high-key firefly, which requires restored wetlands in Japan, or perhaps the Cardinal blue butterfly or a Kirtland's warbler. You pick your favorite, but there are many conservation-dependent species that require regular habitat restoration and conservation. But as we just saw in Jeff Larkin's talk, habitat restoration efforts often have variable outcomes. So that's a map projecting Golden-winged Warbler response to habitat restoration across the Appalachian Mountains with different colors depicting occupancy probability. So we've got cool areas that are very likely to not be occupied and red areas which are expected to be occupied. So variable habitat restoration outcomes. And as we saw with Larkin et al., success can be explained by a variety of factors, including microhabitat, think of your site age and your saplings and your shrubs, things like that. Landscape characteristics like mixed forest, deciduous forest, latitude, longitude, elevation, a whole bunch of variables related to habitat immediately around the restoration site or within the restoration site can predict the variation in restoration outcomes. But there are also other factors that can help explain why we see variation in restoration outcomes for species like the Golden-winged Warblers. Some of these factors can include things like regional population dynamics. So here's a map of the USGS Breeding Bird Survey population trend for the prairie warbler, just as an example. We see red spots there that indicate population declines and blue areas that indicate population growth. So very heterogeneous population structure across the breeding range of that species. And this can influence the availability of dispersing individuals, allele effects, and a variety of other things. So regional population dynamics could theoretically have profound impacts on restoration outcomes. Furthermore, breeding output is another possible driver of restoration outcomes. For example, breeding output, the number of young produced, is an important driver of source sink dynamics. As we know from Van Horn's seminal paper, density alone may be a misleading metric of habitat quality. And that's why it's important to consider factors like breeding success. Now, in considering restoration outcomes and the factors that might drive restoration outcomes, even from a theoretical perspective, the Golden-winged Warbler is a really interesting study species. There are also a variety of practical, applied reasons to study the species, but this bird is, as Jeff just discussed, the subject of enormous habitat restoration efforts through programs like Working Lands for Wildlife, RCPP, and comparable public lands initiatives. And as a result, tens of thousands of hectares have been restored over the past decade. And like the map of the prairie warbler I just showed, the species has heterogeneous population trends across the breeding range with areas of red, mostly in the Appalachian Mountains, that are experiencing pretty widespread declines, and areas of the Great Lakes where the species is relatively stable. This leads us to a main question of our study: to what extent do regional population trends and breeding productivity explain variation in restoration success for programs like the Working Lands for Wildlife and RCPP? In our pursuit to address this question, we looked at 2 portions of the Golden-winged Warbler's range, and this is how Golden-winged Warbler conservationists often think of the species. We sort of split the breeding range into a Great Lakes region, or Great Lakes Conservation Region as it's called in the plan, and an Appalachian Mountains Conservation Region. And we focused most of our efforts in the Great Lakes in Minnesota, where the Golden-winged Warbler population is large and relatively stable, and in Pennsylvania, as well as a little bit of Maryland and New Jersey, where the population size is small and the species is declining quite rapidly. So we have these two conservation regions where much habitat restoration has been implemented, and this gave us the opportunity to assess occupancy of these restored habitats. And this is at the scale of the conservation region. So just Great Lakes and Appalachians. We have many points across each conservation region. In the Great Lakes, this includes both timber harvest and shrub shearing, and in the Appalachian Mountains, this is primarily timber harvest. To explore how productivity might vary within managed habitats, we selected 4 focal landscapes, 2 in the Great Lakes in western Minnesota and eastern Minnesota, and I'll talk about those a bit more later on. And in the Appalachian Mountains, we have eastern Pennsylvania and the Pocono Mountains region, and in central Pennsylvania and the Pennsylvania Wilds region. So in answering our overarching questions, we explored 2 questions therein. Does restoration success differ between the western Great Lakes, where the golden-winged warbler population is large and relatively stable, and the Appalachian Mountains, where the population is small and declining? And does restoration success vary with reproductive output in our 4 focal landscapes? This is a slide very similar to what you saw in Jeff's talk, but here, just in case we had some newcomers, across these restoration sites, we plotted the footprint of the site, buffered it by an 80-meter buffer to ensure that we're not placing survey locations within the habitat edge and sampling a lot of interior forest, and otherwise placed a single point randomly within each habitat patch. At each point count location, we sent a surveyor like Sarah there out into the field to stand in one location for 13 minutes, spend some time quietly, recording golden-winged warbler presence in abundance, after being heavily trained on bird identification, although we didn't need it with that particular technician, and used a combined passive and active survey technique. So that is, she listened quietly, then she took out a speaker and blasted golden-winged warbler songs, and that essentially gave us detection probability nearly 1.0, but I'll talk about how we accounted for detection probability anyway. So Sarah went to this point location twice a year, and this gave us our occupancy data, 1s and 0s for each point count location, to give us a sense for whether the site was occupied by the bird. And if it is, we interpret that as effective restoration success. Within our 4 focal landscapes, we also wanted to assess productivity. And in doing so, we located golden-winged warbler nests in these 4 focal landscapes, monitored nests every 2 to 3 days, and then right before nests were about to fledge their young, which is when young are 7 days old, we attached radio transmitters to the chicks and then followed those chicks for either 30 days when the radio transmitter failed or the chick was killed by something. So our productivity sites, just to give you a better sense for what those are, those were in Rice Lake National Wildlife Refuge in eastern Minnesota and Tamarack National Wildlife Refuge in western Minnesota. And our focal landscapes in Pennsylvania, the eastern Pennsylvania one was Delaware State Forest and Sproul State Forest for central Pennsylvania. So in monitoring these nests, this allowed us to estimate nest success adjusted for re-nesting using survival models and program MARC, as well as fledgling productivity, the number of fledglings produced per nest. But because we know fledgling survival can be quite low in many bird species, we also were able to incorporate fledgling survival rate and nest success, essentially times number of fledglings per successful nest, times fledgling survival rate effectively gives us what we're calling full season productivity, or FSP. This is in units of number of independent juveniles produced per pair per year. So these are fully formed golden-winged warblers able to migrate, unlike a fledgling, which is a very vulnerable individual. So these are actual golden-winged warblers ready to migrate. So across our conservation regions, we monitored 430 point locations, at least for this analysis. We included data for 352 nests and 258 fledglings. Across our 2 conservation regions, we used the robust design occupancy modeling in Unmarked, which allowed us to estimate the dynamic parameters of colonization and extinction, as well as occupancy. And in our 4 focal landscapes, we used static occupancy models with the stacked data design within a 35-kilometer radius around each of our fledgling and nest survival sites. So this allowed us to estimate just single static occupancy around these areas and compare those to the full season productivity within those areas. So what do we find? Looking at the dynamic occupancy first, comparing the Appalachian Mountains to the Great Lakes. Looking at initial site occupancy, we see that occupancy is relatively low, just overall. About just over 20% of sites were occupied in the Appalachian Mountains, where more than 80% of sites were occupied by the end of the study in the Great Lakes. So clearly a big disparity between the Appalachians and the Great Lakes in initial occupancy. But when we look at colonization, that is the probability of an unoccupied site changing state to occupied, we see a similar pattern. In the Appalachian Mountains, pretty low probability of an unoccupied site going to an occupied site, that not zero, but pretty low, whereas this value was much higher in the Great Lakes. That is, sites were generally becoming occupied if they weren't occupied the previous year. Now, if we look at the opposite, which is, we call it local extinction, that is, the probability of a site going from occupied to unoccupied, the reverse pattern was true, with a significantly higher probability of extinction or local extinction in the Appalachians than the Great Lakes. Okay, so looking at productivity, these are occupancy rates, just the simple occupancy in the four conservation, or the four focal landscapes. So our two Great Lakes landscapes, we see occupancy is high, pretty much what we expected. One thing that was interesting, however, in the Appalachians, we have a landscape where occupancy is pretty low, and a landscape where occupancy is high, much like the Great Lakes. So how does full season productivity compare within these four focal landscapes? In the Appalachian Mountains, full season productivity largely mirrored occupancy of restored habitats. That is, our site in eastern Pennsylvania, where productivity of young is quite high, occupancy of restored habitats within that site is also high. In contrast, in the Pennsylvania wilds or central Pennsylvania, where productivity of young is low, occupancy of colonized sites or occupancy of restored sites is low. In the Great Lakes, we find a very different pattern. Productivity of young is intermediate in spite of, or I should say, occupancy of restored sites is high in spite of intermediate productivity in both focal regions. So, bringing this all together, we found that regional demographics appear to predict restoration success. In the Appalachian Mountains, where the species is rapidly declining, occupancy of restored habitats is low, whereas occupancy is high in the Great Lakes, where the species is abundant and relatively stable. We also found that demographics affect population structure of populations, and Jeff kind of talked about this in his presentation a little bit as well. In the Western Great Lakes, detections were not clustered around any given locations, that is, the birds were essentially ubiquitous, whereas in the Appalachian Mountains, detections were very heavily clumped around the Poconos, Pennsylvania wilds, and a small spattering across the south central part of the state. We also found that landscape productivity appears to affect restoration success, with restoration success, restoration success varied among landscapes with different rates of breeding productivity, but this pattern itself varied between regions. So that is, in the Appalachian Mountains, where the species is rare and declining rapidly, high productivity sites yield high restoration success, and the opposite is also true, with low productivity sites yielding low restoration success. But this pattern differed in the Great Lakes, where the species is essentially everywhere. So this pattern of differential full season productivity between the Pennsylvania wilds and the Pocono Mountains, that is our two Pennsylvania landscapes, was puzzling, and we started to explore that a little bit more. And what we found was in Pennsylvania wilds, that is our central Pennsylvania site, the fledglings begged twice as much for food during our fledgling observations than those in the Pocono Mountains. We also found that Pennsylvania wilds fledglings were 10% lighter, whether we're looking at the black dots, which are fledglings that were marked on the day of fledging, or a little bit later during the post-fledging period, the open circles. Fledglings are always about 10% lighter in the Pennsylvania wilds. This led us to ask, could food be limiting? And this is just like preliminary stuff here, but we recruited an undergraduate to go out into these two sites and count caterpillars that these golden-winged warblers specialize on, that is the leaf-rolling caterpillars. And what Dakota Schaefer has found is in the Pocono Mountains, where productivity is high and young are heavy and young don't beg for food much, the density per hectare of leaf-roller caterpillars that these birds specialize is about 11 times higher. So it's important to note that a variety of studies have come out looking at breeding grounds and wintering grounds and trying to interpret what might be driving the decline of the golden-winged warbler. And it might be tempting to think that breeding grounds conservation is not important and that population declines are all driven by wintering grounds. There's a variety of popular literature that now says this. But what we show here is in the Pennsylvania landscapes where we've studied gold-winged warblers, response to habitat restoration seems to be a function of breeding productivity, that is breeding grounds dynamics. And that's important to note that these studies here that have looked at geolocators on gold-winged warblers, on which we're co-authors as well, studied birds in the Pennsylvania wilds and Poconos and found both of those birds go to the same wintering grounds. So at least in this part of the breeding range, factors on the breeding grounds appear to be better explanators of restoration outcomes than wintering grounds conservation. Not to say it's not important. And with that, we have many, many field technicians, the SEEP, Grant, NRCS, and all of our other collaborators, and I'll take any questions.
Time for questions.
Were there any microhabitat features in the Poconos that were associated with that increase in
So the question was, were there any microhabitat features associated with the increase in prey? And yes, there were. So what we found, I should say what Dakota found, and it's too bad he couldn't be here, but what he found is almost all of these leaf roller caterpillars are on the shrub witch hazel. And we looked at all of the 15 most common shrubs and saplings within the timber harvest, but they were almost always on witch hazel. And it was weird. Not only were witch hazel more common in the Poconos, but the witch hazels that were in the Pennsylvania wilds were squeaky clean. None of their leaves had holes chewed in them. None of the leaves were rolled up. I'm sure the witch hazels like the Pennsylvania wilds better, but the ones out in the Poconos are just loaded with those little caterpillars. So that's a great question.
Do the playbacks work? And how do you know you're not bringing birds, attracting birds in?
That's a good question. So the playbacks do work. They work very well. There was a study in 2014 that showed that it boosts detection probability almost to 1.0. And that study also, what's that? So it's still pretty high because these birds sing all the time. It's like 70, 80%, but the playback boosts you up to 95%, something like that. And that study actually suggested that you are drawing birds in. But what we're working in is habitats that are pretty much isolated. So the problem you might have is attracting a bird from outside the managed area, and almost always these sites are managed areas in a landscape that's totally inhospitable for gold-winged warblers. Also, the playback has a limited detection radius, so given that our points are more than 80 meters from a habitat edge, it's pretty unlikely that you would draw a bird, even if you had some other natural habitat, like a wetland right nearby, that you would draw it from the wetland into the managed habitat. But that's a great point.
Did you control the volume?
No, we didn't. Well, I guess in the sense that everybody had the same speaker and everyone turned them up all the way. So, but if someone like dropped it against a rock and didn't tell me, yeah, I wouldn't know.
In your Appalachian study area, did you find any blue wing on these sites?
That's a really good point. I had so much information that I had to cut a lot of things out, but no. So we recorded actually all species of birds, much to my field technician's dismay. We were having them write down all the cuckoos and owls and every other warbler. And blue wings were actually quite rare. The place where we saw them the most was in New Jersey, and occupancy was still less than 10%. So across Pennsylvania and New Jersey, or Pennsylvania and Maryland, I would get pretty excited if I saw a blue wing because they're so rare out there. It's probably less than 2% occupancy. It's quite low. Too low to model.
Okay. Thanks, DJ.